All right, we are going to finish up our study of the Proverbs. In no way did we exhaust every topic in it, but I'll go through it a little bit, what I think we've covered throughout this series of just wisdom and in fact, just kind of overcoming the mistakes that tend to pile up when we do things our way and have our plan, and listening to the wisdom of God and what He might say instead. And as we mentioned last week and kind of saw video evidence, it's just so much worse when we blow things up than let God kind of operate within us and how we work. And so that's what we're going to do. I do want to start with a positive. This was just something that happened this week in a week where personally, I had to cancel things I didn't want to cancel. I had to put off things I didn't want to put off. I've been trying for my parents to come see us for now it's been a year. And I think for all of us, that phone call of, okay, let's wait a few more months. Nobody wanted to have that conversation, but we had it, and it's sad. But with all that sadness going on, I will say this. My family, I moved them here a little over 5 years ago from California. I know everyone here hears that and thinks, well, you've got to be the most excited people in the world to leave California. And generally that was true, except for people, right? You leave people behind, a family in Christ. It's beautiful. We still love and miss, although most of them left California too. The one thing that my family, non-person related, really, truly, kids all the way up, missed the most was In-N-Out. It was just one of those things we couldn't get over. It had kind of slinked up to Portland or the Oregon area, and it had slinked down to Arizona, but it didn't come this far. And then it was just this feeling of, where are we where there is no In-N-Out? And it came to town, and it opened Friday. And here we were, in a dark winter, just kind of wondering, when will things be great? And some true friends who had waited in line for hours and got to the end of the line and realized we didn't wait here just for us, we're buying more, dropped by some In-N-Out. And I have since thought it was a big mistake not to turn that fry basket into a mask, because I missed the smell of it. It was just incredible. In fact, there may be a business, young people, in that, the In-N-Out mask. I'm not sure about skin and grease and all of that, but the smell is beautiful. So to have a good friend is a great thing. And you're not always afforded that in life. It's just what it is. In fact, if you read the Bible carefully, and especially follow the Christ figure throughout, kind of the image of that, and Christ himself as he's on earth, the idea that you would have a good friend is not guaranteed. But what the Christian is called to is to be a good friend. And that's what Jesus shows us and certainly demonstrates. And I want to talk a little bit about to start friend and neighbor. And then I'm going to, just to kind of get all the proverb I can into our last lesson together in this topic, going to end with a perspective and the idea of life and death that the proverb certainly covers as well. And so kind of travel with me through this idea of friend and neighbor. The truth is, in the Hebrew, friend and neighbor, though they sound so different to us, come from the same word. In fact, it comes from a word that's really broad and general. It's the context itself that kind of settles in on what you're talking about in terms of intimacy. And so friend and neighbor would probably best be described for us in English as this word fellow. To one extreme, it's just the fellow who's taken you to court and has something to say against you in Proverbs 18:17. And then the other far extreme, it's Proverbs 17:17, which we should all hold dear. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. There's an intimate friend. And so you've got this broad concept that's ushered in. And I bring that up because I find it interesting that is the very word that God introduces in his law. Jesus would summarize the whole of the law, and all of the prophets are kind of summed up into these two key principles: that you would love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that principle comes up, loving your neighbor. Well, that's fellow. That's what that word is. It's kind of the whole broad spectrum. And I believe it's important because in this most important commandment, God is telling each of us to personalize what can be a very impersonal term. You see, we can love our neighbor as ourselves if we make them our friend. You'll go further there. You'll follow this. You'll see what, and listen, it's not insignificant that as Jesus is preparing to leave this world, he pulls his disciples close and says, I no longer call you slaves, but friends. And he's calling us to now be friends to this world, to know how to love our neighbor by putting him into that category. So that's really what I want to go through here this morning is to start at least with the idea of friend. I do think it's important as we've gone through a whole bunch of material to stop once in a while and tell you, hey, guess what? We have learned something. We've put some thoughts together. Why I love the Proverbs is they're so chocked full of godly principles. And here's just to mention a few, what we've done throughout this series. We've talked about this principle of fearing the Lord. That is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs 1:7 and 9:10. It's this idea that this holy God who knows all things and is holy, 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 is seeking a relationship with his broken and fallen people, his wayward sons. He's bringing us back in. What a beautiful lesson we've learned in fearing the Lord. We've learned to do our work well, as Paul would write in Colossians 3:23, as unto the Lord. And we learned that lesson from the fool, who's kind of like the counter lesson to what that looks like. We've learned to redeem the time, and I say we've learned. If you've read through the Proverbs these last 2 months, you've learned it. That lesson comes from the sluggard, and I just don't know if I didn't have the time or the endurance to put that lesson together. We did not cover the sluggard. Chalk that up for what it is, but you learn to make the most of the moment, to seize the time you're given. We learn to make and keep and promote peace, to be a good friend, as we'll see today in Matthew 5:9 and Romans 12:18 is a lesson learned from loving your fellow or your neighbor. We talked about using our words to build up and to control our speech, which is a lesson learned from what we say. We've learned that marriage is a gift from God, that he loves us so much. He's given us this great union in which he founded society. We learned that if you love your family, you discipline them, you correct them, which is a lesson learned from childishness or foolishness. And finally, and we'll look at this at the end today, we'll learn to live in hope. No matter what circumstances life brings, to live in hope, keeping our eyes above the clouds, above the sun. And of course, that's a lesson learned from a perspective in life and death. So let's just start with neighbor here now. Again, I've talked about it's a very broad word. But wisdom extols qualities of neighborliness that really, if you put them all together and add them all up into a pot, what you get is love. And that loving your neighbor certainly comes out. And I want to just kind of show you a few of these. And I'm not going to go one by one through them today. I'm going to put them up there and you can go through and study on your own. But if you're going to be a good neighbor, I can't help but think of Like a Good Neighbor. State Farm is there. But if you want to be a good neighbor, a real neighbor, as God wants us to be, you're going to need to be safe. A good neighbor, Proverbs 3:29, reminds us that you should be reluctant to be a strife starter. We would say troublemaker. There's something about trouble that loves to be stirred up, and a good neighbor won't go there. Proverbs 3:29, do not devise harm against your neighbor while he lives securely beside you. Be a safe neighbor. Be that person who's not going to be kind of trying to mix things up, stir things up. The other part of this, you're not only not a strife starter, don't be a strife spreader. You know, how many times has the information just fallen into your lap? And it's kind of fun to spread that around and make sure it gets passed on. Well, a good neighbor won't do that. Proverbs 25:8 says, do not go hastily to argue your case. Otherwise, what will you do in the end when your neighbor humiliates you? You got information, but it may not be yours to share. It doesn't promote peace. Another thing just kind of mentioned about what a good neighbor is. I just believe a good neighbor should be disarmingly kind. And I say that because it's easy as neighbors to be up in arms. But this is a kindness that kind of loosens the guard and helps us, again, feel that safety we mentioned earlier. Proverbs 24:17 says, do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles, or the Lord will see it and be displeased and turn his anger away from you. I've always thought of that verse. I mean, early on in my life when we were playing games as a family, it wasn't that I just wanted to win. I loved seeing my brother lose. There's something in that needs to come out of us to be a good neighbor. We need to be kind. Disarming in that sense is the principle. Proverbs 25:21, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. And if he's thirsty, give him water to drink. For you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. We should be generous with our judgments. Here's the kindness we're talking about. That passage, which we're familiar with because it shows up again in Romans, is one that I think has built kind of a bad habit in Christians. We pick up this concept of, I'm going to do the right thing because it's going to make them so mad. That's not what it's talking about. That's an Exodus passage. And in the Exodus, when people truly trusted God to lead them where they were going, because they were lost. They had no concept where they should have been there in 3 days. It took them a long, long time. But they just had to follow the fire and the smoke. And when they did, at times they left their burning coals behind. Burning coals that they would cook their meals on, boil their water on. Life was found in that fire. And if your neighbor forgot their coals, even if they were a bad neighbor, you lived among clans. We know how bad that can be. Some neighbors just aren't that great. Some family aren't that great. You would be the kind of neighbor that would take your burning coals that you carried all day on your head and heap them on their head so that they had life too. You see, we're not being good or kind so others feel spiteful. We're showing them the kind of love that Jesus showed us. And so it's good to remember to be generous in that way. A good neighbor understands the benefit of silence. We harp on Job's friends, but I just want to point out, for many days, they were great friends. Because in his great calamity, they shut up. They showed up, but they kept their mouths shut. And how hard that had to be. To want to say something, to want to interject, but to just know, to see on this man's face and his body that he was suffering, to be there was enough. Once they spoke, they interjected too much of themselves. And that's something the good friend, the good neighbor has to learn. Proverbs 11:12 says, "He who despises his neighbor lacks sense, but a man of understanding keeps silent." Sometimes that's just what the doctor ordered. A good neighbor is truly helpful. I mentioned at the beginning of this study, a study of wisdom is dangerous in a sense, because you can take all of this information and turn it into these very practical and useful steps that make your life better. And I'm telling you, you follow God's wisdom, it'll make your life better in so many ways. But what you will be quick to do as a human being is think all of a sudden, look how well ordered my life is. Their lives aren't ordered that way. And it's easy to look down on those who need help. Instead of what wisdom would say, just help. That's what's needed. Proverbs 14:21 says, "He who despises his neighbor sins, but happy is he who is gracious to the poor." Those who have failed, guess what they really need? They need a hand. They need help. They don't need your judgment. They don't need an "I told you so." You can all think of the time when you heard someone tell you, "I told you so," and how useful that really was. Help them up. It's what a good neighbor would do. A good neighbor is careful. Again, we can't let our feelings overbalance this idea of kindness. And so we need to understand, good must overcome evil. That being true, there are some fellows that want to overcome your good with evil. And so you're going to need to learn how to make distinction. That's discernment, as we studied it in this book of wisdom. And so Proverbs 22:24 says, "Do not associate with a man given to anger, or go with a hot-tempered man, or you will learn his ways and find a snare for yourself." And so this discernment tells us, look, we got to be careful about our interactions here. We do have some boundaries in that we can draw. And a good neighbor is willing. They know how to say yes to doing good. "Do not withhold good from those with whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. Do you say to your neighbor, 'Go and come back tomorrow, I will give it to you,' when you have it with you?" I've had to learn this over time as a neighbor. You can or you cannot help. That's just the truth. And if you cannot, then that's not held against you. But if you can, don't put it off. Doing good for others, being willing to help others is what a good neighbor is all about. Well, let's kind of tweak that a little bit into this context of friendship. That's also mentioned within the Proverbs. And again, the word kind of spreads itself around. Context helps us out here. I'll just give you kind of a couple quick ideas throughout wisdom that a good friend should be. And this is not a lesson to where you can say, "Oh, I have such bad friends because there's none of these things in them." We're trying to be the good friend. That's the point. And so you should at least see these things in Jesus elevate them in your own life so that others can benefit and perhaps maybe learn from it as well. So the first thing I'd say about a good friend in Proverbs is there is constancy. I've actually come to really like that word as I've gone through this study. I've mentioned the same thing with brotherhood. There's something about someone who is not constantly moving, hard to get a hold. They're constant. I have to this day people I haven't seen in decades that I could call on, and I know they would be there. They're this kind of friend, constant. Proverbs shows us that fair weather friends are a dime a dozen. Proverbs 14:20, the poor is hated even by his neighbor, but those who love the rich are many. If you have something to offer, you'll find lots of good friends. Proverbs 19:4, wealth adds many friends, but a poor man is separated from his friends. Verse 6, many will seek the favor of a generous man, and every man is a friend to the one who gives gifts. We get it, right? Some friends come along really easily, but they're not this. They're not a constant friend. You see, real friendship is painted as a gift. There are 2 proverbs with this concept of friendship in it that you can't really read accurately if you don't read Jesus into it. And the first is Proverbs 18:24. It says, a man of too many friends comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And Jesus, being that for us, wants us to be that kind of constant friend to another. And I want to give you the context of this. That means being humans, having difficulties in friendships, you will have struggles, there will be strife. That's just a guarantee. No matter how many things you have in common to start, there will be a disagreement at some point. What it means is because of the friendship Christ gave you, you stick it out and give that friendship to another regardless, no matter what. That kind of constancy changes the world. It builds up the body. The other passage is 17:17. It's an easy one to remember. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. It's just the idea that when life heats up, when it gets really difficult, you'll start to notice certain friends find out, this is too much for me to handle, I'm backing off. But there's a friend who will stand in the fire with you. Sound familiar? 3 men go into a fiery furnace and 4 are seen. Because when no one was there to stand for those 3 men, Jesus showed up. And he wants us to be that kind of constant friend to others. I just say this again. It's easy to get caught up in thinking only about the friend we want. Well, I want from my friend. All the disappointments we've had from our friends. But wisdom has us focused on giving kindness, giving loyalty, not necessarily always receiving it. And especially that old family friend. That one that's been constant all this time. Proverbs 27:10 is really beautiful. It says, do not forsake your own friend on your father or your father's friend, and do not go to your brother's house in the day of your calamity. Better is a neighbor who is near than a brother far away. That time-tested true friend. Don't forget them. They're there. They're constant. Another kind of quality of friendship here that's kind of promoted throughout the Proverbs is that of candor. And I just want to point out that this is probably one of the bigger problems with friendships in our day, and probably for always. But a friend knows how to be frank. What a difficult skill to try to build up. But it's the kind of transparency we all say we crave, and yet have real difficulty living out. Candor of a whole new level. It's not a love that conceals or refuses to reveal the faults of a friend. That's not a godly love. You think about this. God loves you, but has he stopped showing you where you could improve or where you've been wrong? No, he loves us too much to do that. And so Proverbs 27:5 says, better is open rebuke than love that is concealed. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. You know, the Proverbs goes a long way to say that you will be able to find people who will flatter you. But that's not friendship. People that tell you what you want to hear, say what you want to hear, are not your friends. Proverbs 29:5 says, a man who flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his steps. You know, David had this very problem. He had a son, a second son, Adonijah, that was just like Absalom. Beautiful and knew it. flaunted it, told everyone about it, decided he was next to be king. And in 1 Kings 1:6 it says his father had never crossed him at any time by asking, "Why have you done so?" It cost him his life. You know, I love that passage brings this kind of friendship into the parent-child relationship again. That's how the Proverbs is taught, remember. Will you be the kind of parent that in your own estimation loves your child too much to correct them and never crosses them ever and lets them perish? Or will you be a friend, a real friend, that points out what needs to be done? You see, the reward for frankness, and this is probably why it's not as prevalent in our friendships, it isn't instant. It's often very awkward, most times very painful, and usually causes some sort of separation and distance for a while. But it isn't meant to be instant. You see, real loyalty and honesty will be rewarded, but it's always needed. Proverbs 28:23 says, "He who rebukes a man will afterwards find more favor than he who flatters him with a tongue." In a practical sense, my dad had this kind of candor. As I started to draw blueprints, and houses, I kind of got into that. I took the art from my mom and the construction from my dad. I thought, oh, this is what I want to do. And I would take my first little blueprint to my mom, and she would just go on and on. It should go in Home and Garden right now. It's beautiful. Can I frame it? And I'd go with all that pride to my dad and say, "What do you think?" And he says, "It doesn't work. That door goes nowhere. This doesn't. What were you thinking here? What size is this room anyway?" And he just really had some candor that was uncomfortable. As I got more serious about that and started drawing actual blueprints, you know who I went to first? I went to my dad for real candor and frankness. There'll come a time when you'll trust those who are able to say, "That's not right that you're behaving that way. You can't treat people like that. You're better than that." It's more than just correction. You'll see they love you. And there's not a lot of people in the world that will do that for you. Another thing about a good friend is they'll give you good counsel. I just kind of divide this into two thoughts. First, friendly counsel, like when you need it and you want it and they'll sit with you. Friendly fellowship, it just cheers you up. It changes your whole body language and manner. I think it's a whole lot like that smell that reminds you of home. In and out. This is good. Proverbs 27:9 beautifully says, "Oil and perfume make the heart glad. So a man's counsel is sweet to his friend." What a blessing to have that friend that will counsel you and sit with you and talk with you. In fact, I think this in part is what helped the spirit of David. You think about this anointed king running for his life from a wicked man. And what kept his spirit up, what helped him as he ran, was that Jonathan had just that kind of encouragement for David. In 1 Samuel 23:15, now David became aware of Saul and had come out to seek his life while David was in the wilderness. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David and encouraged him in God. Thus he said to him, "Do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you. And you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you." And Saul my father knows that too. Don't forget, as David ran and that got hard, that he had a friend that kept speaking God's counsel to him. And it encouraged him. Now, not only is friendly counsel uplifting, it strengthens you. It causes you to grow. And this can show up in a healthy clash of personalities or a difference of opinions. Proverbs 27:17 says, "Iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another." Just want you to picture that. That's not a gentle picture. There's a clashing of iron on iron. Not for the purpose of destruction, but to sharpen, to make them better, to help them grow. And you need a friend who will counsel you like this, to say the hard things, to challenge you in deep things of God. You see, in friendship, these differences bring us closer, not further apart. You see, a valuable friend will not be afraid to disagree with us or even rebuke us. And I'll just I don't want to get old and say kids these days, ever. But I think this applies to adults as well. Social media is ruining the way we view friendship. No, it's not. It's just a tool. We're ruining the way we see friendship because of how we use these tools. And you can unfriend someone and unlike someone and unfollow someone and just disregard them from your life. And one thing I've noticed, you can do all that online and show up in person and pretend it's all okay, and it's not. And I'll tell you this, God knows the difference. And I've heard for too long, even before social media, believe me, the church say things like, well, we can love each other and not like each other. That is garbage. God called you to be a friend, neighbor. And you got to like people. You got to love people. And it's going to get tough, but you got to stick with it. You see, as good friends, we'll start to respect people for our differences. We'll start to view sides we hadn't seen before. We'll see the value in them letting us know. A true friendship should have both those elements to them. Friends reassure us and they calm us and they build us up and they make us stronger. And finally, and this is probably where most friendships come to die, is the lack of tact. Tact is a fun word, and we actually ought to start thinking about this in our interactions, live and otherwise. Tact is just having a respect for the feelings of others. Once we move to this place where you can make any comment anywhere and have no accountability to it, tact just kind of went out the door. We stopped thinking about others' feelings and caring for where they were at. We betrayed our friends' affections. There are many familiar sounding proverbs about this, and they're familiar because we've lived it. It's just this lapse in tact. It could be overstaying your welcome or pushing yourself on others. Proverbs 25:17, let your foot rarely be in your neighbor's house, or he will be weary of you and hate you. Yeah, that's something to think about. How do they feel about it? I know you're excited. I know they cook well, but were they expecting you? Maybe you've been guilty of showing exuberance at the wrong time. It wasn't the wrong time for you. It was just wrong for your fellow. Proverbs 27:14, he who blesses his friend with a loud voice early in the morning, it will be reckoned a curse to him. I remember this many times as a youth, being woken up early by an exuberant mom because of the chores that laid ahead and thinking, I'm sleeping. Tact. She's listening. I'm not accusing you of not having tact, Mom. I wouldn't dare, even at this age. It could be trying to comfort someone and just getting it all wrong. Didn't we just talk about that with Job's friends? They got it right. And then they just got it all wrong. Proverbs 25:20, like one who takes off a garment on a cold day, or they must have known about college football early on, or like vinegar on soda is he who sings songs to a troubled heart. That tact to know how to say, when to say what needs to be said is something that we build up in these real friendships. Too many times, though, most friendships implode or explode because we don't have the tact to recognize something's not going the right way and we push too far. And it could be something as simple as just not knowing when a joke has gone too far. I love Proverbs 26:18 and 19 for this. It says, like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death. By the way, a madman would be throwing firebrands, arrows, and death. So is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, I was just kidding. I was only joking. Tact won't let us do that. You see, a real friend is attentively aware of others' feelings, concerns, dislikes, strengths, weaknesses, shortcomings, gifts. And having all that intimate knowledge, they refuse to trade on their friend, to use that in a way that would hurt them. Sharing insider information's always been a temptation. But the real friend won't trade on the ones they love. And that brings up a very important point when it comes to being a friend. There is a vulnerability to this. It's built in. Any intimate relationship with a human being brings up vulnerability. In fact, if you ever thought about this, I know some conversations in our prayer discussions have come about this, about whether we struggle being vulnerable to God. You don't really need to struggle being vulnerable to God because He's the one being that won't use that against you. He won't betray you with it. He won't use it to hurt you. He's the being who is holy, holy, holy. And so we can be fully open, bare before God and be okay. But to attempt this at the human realm will bring up vulnerabilities. Friendship as a topic, frankly, in the book of Proverbs often shows up in situations of betrayal. The closest term used for friendship in the book is bosom companion. And to you Anne of Green Gable fans, she must have been a King James reader. That's where that comes from, that bosom pal, bosom companion. That's just saying how close you really are. And so to the harlot, the woman who's turned on her vows to her husband, Proverbs 2:17 says, she leaves the companion, that's the bosom friend of her youth, and forgets her covenant with God. She's betrayed that trust. Proverbs 16, a couple important thoughts here. Proverbs 16:28 says, a perverse man spreads strife, and a slanderer separates intimate friends. So somebody knows something, and you trust them to do the best with it, but you can't guarantee it. And so there's a vulnerable part of opening up like that. We see it estranged at times. Proverbs 17:9 is the other one. He who conceals a transgression seeks love. That's a partner passage to the love covering a multitude of sins. It isn't pretending it didn't happen. It's just, this is information we're dealing with. We're not going to spread it around. But he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends. And so the reminder is even the closest of friendships need to be guarded, need to be maintained. And I will tell you this, at a human level, friendship is still something we ought to just really build and build and build and seek and seek and seek. And don't ever let the hurts of the past keep you from wanting more of it, because within it, we see the beauty of Christ. But what we need to introduce to our side of friendship, like we do with our relationship with God, is forgiveness. You got to let those things go and keep building up. Building up. You see, even close friendships are open to the dangers of thoughtlessness. Yeah, I've had friends. I love them. I just didn't think before I was speaking. I didn't think of how they were feeling. And thoughtlessness will be this arrow that gets thrown. It could even be malice at times or jealousy. Proverbs 16:28, a perverse man spreads strife and a slanderer separates intimate friends. You know, work on those feelings or just seeking the advantage. You see, the qualities of a peacemaker should be in us as neighbors and friends. But it's much more common for us to hurt those we're closest to. And so these intimate friendships, in order for them to have integrity, they depend on spiritual resources. I just want to challenge you this week. Pray for God's power to make you a good neighbor. It's what He's asked us to do. The whole law and the prophets hinge on that. Love your neighbor as yourself. And work every day on being a friend like Jesus is a friend. Got a whole other section. And I'm just going to leave it to you. But I'll tell you this. When it comes to life and death in the Proverbs, this would be a good study for us to do, especially at this point in our experience or journey. We get one, and it matters how you live it. And there's a record. And it isn't that God's just kind of waiting for you to stumble and He'll forever hold that against you. Praise God, He's the best friend you could ever have, because He's willing to overlook if you'll overcome. But you get one life to live. And so I want to challenge you. Go through the Proverbs as you finish out this month and start looking for those terms. 20 to 30 times in the book is this concept of life and death. And what it will have you think of is maybe the things that we think this life is all about aren't what this life is all about. That perhaps, and when you get through Proverbs, maybe you'll just turn the page to Ecclesiastes. Perhaps it isn't the things beneath the sun that matter. In fact, everything under the sun is pointless and futile and vanity, says the preacher Solomon. Maybe what we've been overlooking, maybe what's hurt our family, maybe what's hurt our work with God, maybe what's hurt our friendship and neighborliness toward the world is we've stopped living above the sun. Because there's where you will find a friend who is closer than a brother, and who is born for adversity, and who is waiting for us to complete this life we get in a way that brings honor to him so he can bring us home. I was going to end with death. That seems too cheery right now, and so we'll just stay right there. I want to challenge you. The Christian should live and die in hope, because what we're living for and what we'll die for is above the sun. If you're not a Christian this morning, I just want to give this invitation quickly to you. The perspective is great. That in this life, we'll give it our fair try, but reality says we're going to stray, we're going to wander like sheep without a shepherd. We're going to go our own way. But praise God, he sent a true friend as the shepherd of our souls to call us back. And if you're willing to listen to Christ the shepherd this morning, he wants you to die with him, be buried with him in baptism, so that you might live with him and he can lead you. Think about that. God doesn't save you and then put you in the game to figure it out. He saves you and says, take my hand, I will lead you. We can walk humbly with our God down this path. I also want to point out as we come to the end of Proverbs, not once throughout this study was there this idea that if you just do these things right, everything's going to be easy. I think there's a reason that the longer we walk with God, the more aware we become of the difficulties of this life. It kind of comes later in that stage. Because if we had known how hard it was just to stay on this path in the beginning, we might have just said no to start with. But he brings us in with the idea of real love, real friendship, real fellowship, real redemption. And on the way, what you learn is the hardship and the trial and the struggle is worth it, because fellowship with God is all you live for. And he doesn't hoard it. He says, love me with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then you'll know how to love your neighbor as yourself. What a good God we have. Every step of the way, he'll lead us. If you're ready to be a part of God's family and join him in baptism this morning, you can be born again right now. If you need our prayers, again, before we leave, go ahead and ask us, and we'll pray for you. God listens. God cares. He's watching this journey, and he's waiting for his children to wake up, hear his wisdom crying out on the streets, and say, God, I hear you. I want you. Help me. If we can help you, you can let us know.